Hello and welcome to another homework help video. This video continues a series on typical banking problems found in introductory macroeconomics and finance economics courses. This video looks at calculating the required reserves of a bank when individuals put more money into a bank that already has deposits. Before looking at a typical problem statement and a way to answer the problem statement, let's review some terms and concepts. Before looking at calculating the money the bank needs to retain to meet the central bank's requirements, let's take a minute to review the terms: fractional banking, deposit, reserve ratio, and required reserves. One of the keystones of understanding modern banking systems is fractional banking. A fractional banking system is where banks and other thrift institutions, like savings and loans and credit unions, accept money for deposit. They use this money to make loans and collect interest on the loans. However, the government requires banks to keep part of the deposits so depositors can access their money if needed. A deposit is the money an individual places in the bank for future use. Required reserves are part of the bank's deposit, which it must hold in case the depositor wants their money. The reserve ratio is the ratio of required reserves to deposits. Problem statements may represent the reserve ratio as a decimal, or a rational number or a percentage. If the reserve ratio in the problem statement is a decimal, or a rational number, the formula for calculating the required reserves is required reserves equal deposits times reserve ratio. If the reserve ratio is part of the problem statement as a percentage, the formula for calculating the required reserves is required reserves equal deposits times the quantity of reserve ratio divided by 100%. A bank's required reserves are part of its deposits, and the government requires them to be kept on hand to satisfy the customer demand for their funds. Now let's look at a problem statement with a reserve ratio given as a rational number or a decimal number. A new bank with no deposits on its balance sheet receives a deposit of $5,000. The country's central bank requires banks to have a reserve ratio of 0.025 of their deposits. How much of the bank's deposits must it hold in reserve to meet the central bank's reserve requirement? Let's look at the strategy to find the bank's required reserves given a deposit of funds to a new bank and a central bank's reserve ratio represented by a rational number. 1. Write the formula for calculating the required reserves. Required reserve equals deposit times reserve ratio. 2. From the problem statement, locate the deposit amount and substitute it into the formula. 3. From the problem statement, locate the reserve ratio and substitute it into the formula. 4. Multiply the amount of the deposit by the reserve ratio. Now let's apply the strategy to the problem statement. 1. Write the formula for calculating the required reserves. Required reserve equals deposit times reserve ratio. 2. From the problem statement, locate the deposit amount and substitute it into the formula. In the problem statement, the bank receives a $5,000 deposit. So, let's substitute $5,000 from the problem statement into the formula for the deposit. 3. From the problem statement, locate the reserve ratio and substitute it into the formula. In the problem statement, the central bank has set the reserve ratio to 0.025. So, let's substitute 0.025 from the problem statement into the formula for the reserve ratio. 4. Multiply the amount of the deposit by the reserve ratio. The deposit from the problem statement is $5,000, and the reserve ratio is 0.025. So, multiplying the deposit of $5,000 by the reserve ratio of 0.025 is $125. The answer to the problem statement is the amount of required reserves for the bank is $125. One of the critical pieces of knowledge for understanding modern fractional banking is the idea of required reserves, and an important skill is calculating the required amount. The video reviewed some key terms associated with fractional banking, including fractional banking, deposits, reserve ratio, and required reserves. The video also introduced the formula for calculating the required reserves. Required reserves equal deposits times the reserve ratio represented as a rational number. The video provided a strategy for finding the required reserves when the problem statement included information about the deposit size and the reserve ratio represented as a decimal or rational number. Finally, the video worked through a problem statement using the strategy. If you want to try a practice problem independently, there is a link in the description below. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, please put them in the comments section below. Until the next homework help video, best wishes on your economic studies.